Stop blaming inflation. Stop blaming politicians, and stop blaming yourself. Because the reason life feels unaffordable in America right now isn't just higher prices. It's that the entire system quietly recalculated what survival costs without raising pay to match it. You're not imagining it. You're not bad with money. And you're not falling behind because you did something wrong. What's happening is bigger. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why working harder no longer creates breathing room, and why millions of Americans feel exhausted even when they're redoing everything right. Before we break it down, this is GeoGlobe, where we explain the forces reshaping daily life, power, and survival around the world. If you want clarity instead of noise, subscribe now, because what's coming next matters more than people realize. You don't need charts to know something is wrong. You feel it before anyone explains it, before the statistics, before the headlines. You feel it when the rent renewal email arrives and your stomach tightens before you even open it. When the electric bill lands and you hesitate, hoping it's not as bad as last month. When you buy the same groceries you always have, no extras, no indulgences, and still pay more every single time. As America moves deeper into 2026, millions of people are asking the same quiet question they rarely say out loud. How am I supposed to survive like this? This isn't panic, it isn't exaggeration, and it isn't irresponsibility. It's the lived reality of people who followed the instructions exactly as they were given. Work full time, save when you can, avoid unnecessary debt, be practical, be disciplined. And yet, month after month, the math still doesn't work. A young woman sets aside money on payday, determined to build savings, only to pull it right back out days later for groceries and gas. A man works 6 days a week, driving hours every day, realizing he can no longer afford the one small expense that once made his life feel balanced. Families stare at power bills that rival rent payments and wonder what rule they broke. The uncomfortable truth is this: they didn't break any rules. The system changed, quietly, while people were busy surviving inside it. For decades, Americans were taught that effort compounds, that stability builds slowly but reliably, that life might be hard, but it gets easier if you keep moving forward. That assumption no longer holds. Wages may look higher on paper, but their buying power has thinned. The essentials that make life function, housing, food, energy, transportation, have climbed faster than income for years. Not in dramatic spikes that trigger alarms, but in steady increases that feel manageable alone and crushing together. This creates a dangerous psychological shift. People don't feel broke, they feel trapped. They budget carefully, they cut back, they work overtime when it's available, and still, the margin never grows. It disappears. That's why advice has stopped landing. Not because people are lazy, not because they've given up, but because motivation doesn't fix math. You cannot grind your way out of a system where the cost of entry keeps rising faster than income. When survival itself demands more than a full-time wage, effort becomes maintenance, not progress. This isn't a personal failure, it's a structural one. And the place where that failure becomes impossible to ignore is housing, because shelter isn't optional. For most Americans, the housing crisis isn't something they see on a graph. It's a moment. Sitting in a car after a long shift, staring at the dashboard, trying to figure out how next month's rent is going to work. It's realizing that even if nothing goes wrong, there's still no room left. Rent has risen faster than wages across most of the country. In many areas, even modest apartments now require incomes that full-time workers simply don't earn. 40 hours a week no longer guarantees stable housing without stress. Homeownership, once the escape from rising rent, now feels even further away. The median home price sits at levels that demand incomes far beyond what most households earn. A generation ago, buying a home required sacrifice. Today, it requires exceptional income, outside help, or timing that borders on luck. This didn't happen because people suddenly wanted luxury homes. It happened because supply stalled, borrowing costs surged, and housing slowly shifted from shelter into an asset class. Investors bought what families couldn't. Insurance costs climbed, construction lagged, and prices hardened instead of correcting. The result isn't just financial strain, it reshapes lives. Renting becomes permanent instead of temporary. Buying gets pushed into later adulthood. Stability feels delayed rather than earned. And once housing consumes the largest share of income, every other expense becomes sharper, because there's no cushion left. This is when people realize the cost of living isn't just high, it's compounding, and housing is only the first layer. Because once shelter takes its share, the pressure doesn't disappear, it spreads. That's where the real squeeze begins. For many Americans, the real shock doesn't come from rent or mortgage. It comes from everything wrapped around it. The bills you don't think about until they arrive, the ones you can't negotiate away, the ones that make your stomach drop before you even open the envelope. Utilities, insurance, transportation. Together, they've quietly formed what many households now experience as a second rent, a cluster of unavoidable costs that drain income regardless of raises, overtime, or careful budgeting. And once these expenses lock in, they don't loosen. Take electricity. On paper, the average electric bill doesn't sound catastrophic, but averages hide reality. In states with extreme heat, aging grids, or long cooling seasons, $400 and $500 monthly bills are no longer rare. A woman in Texas shared her summer statements online. June, over $500. July, closer to $650. August, projected even higher. She wasn't living in a large home. She wasn't running anything extravagant. She was doing what millions of people do, trying to stay cool during dangerous heat while cutting costs everywhere else. And it still wasn't enough. Add water bills that rise with drought restrictions. Trash fees that used to be included and are now itemized. Internet costs that are no longer optional because work, school, and basic life now depend on connectivity. What used to be background expenses have moved to the foreground. Then there's insurance. Auto insurance rates have surged across the country, not because people suddenly became reckless drivers, but because repairs cost more, vehicles are more expensive, and claim severity has increased. Home insurance has followed the same path, especially in regions facing climate-related risks. These aren't luxuries you can opt out of. They're requirements. And every increase tightens the budget further. Transportation completes the trap. In much of the United States, owning a car isn't a choice. It's a prerequisite for employment. Public transit is limited or non-existent for millions of workers. Jobs are spread farther from affordable housing. Remote work isn't available for entire industries. So people buy cars not because they want to, but because they have to. Monthly payments climb, insurance stacks on top, fuel fluctuates, but rarely feels cheap. Maintenance waits for no one. The result is a fixed drain on income that arrives every month, no matter how disciplined you are. Together, utilities, insurance, and transportation don't just add pressure. They lock it in. They don't scale down easily. They don't pause when money gets tight. They arrive whether you're thriving or barely holding on. That's why even small setbacks now feel dangerous. Because when most of your income is already committed to survival, there's no buffer left. And when the buffer disappears, the first place people feel it isn't housing. It's food. If there's one place where the cost of living crisis becomes impossible to ignore, it's the grocery store. You can delay a car repair, you can negotiate rent, you can cancel subscriptions, but you can't stop eating. That's why the grocery aisle has become a pressure cooker. A young woman explains it simply. Every payday, she sets aside a little money for savings. Not much, just enough to feel responsible. And every time, within days, she pulls it right back out. Not for shopping, not for fun, for groceries, for gas, for the basics that get her through the next 2 weeks. Every time I try to save, she says, something essential takes it back. That isn't poor discipline. It's a signal that essentials themselves have become too expensive. Food prices surged during the pandemic, and while the pace of increases slowed, prices never returned to where they were. They settled at a higher baseline. That means each paycheck quietly buys less than it did the year before. A grocery run that once felt routine now requires planning, comparison, and sacrifice. Families switch brands, cut portions, skip items, and still watch the total climb. But cost isn't the only issue. Access matters too. In many lower-income or rural areas, major grocery chains have closed or consolidated. What's left are smaller stores with higher prices and fewer fresh options. Processed food stays cheap. Fresh produce costs more. When budgets tighten, people buy what stretches, not what nourishes. That choice has consequences. Parents skip meals so their kids don't have to. Individuals choose shelf-stable foods because the math leaves no room for anything else. The grocery bill stops being about nutrition and starts being about survival. This is the moment when many people realize something fundamental has shifted. When even feeding yourself feels like a financial burden, it's no longer about budgeting apps or lifestyle choices. It's about an economy where the floor has risen faster than income can follow. And when cash can't stretch any further, people turn to the one thing that still offers flexibility: credit. For a growing number of Americans, survival is no longer paid for with cash. It's financed, not because people are reckless, not because they're chasing luxury, but because the cost of living has quietly outgrown what paychecks can handle. One creator lays out her monthly expenses calmly: rent, utilities, car payment, insurance, groceries, gas. Then she stops and asks the question so many households wrestle with in silence. Which one of these can I skip this month and catch up on later? That question marks a turning point. When income no longer covers necessities, credit becomes the buffer. A swipe here, a balance carried there, not for vacations or gadgets, but for food, power, repairs, and emergencies. Credit cards become the bridge between the life people are living and the life they're trying to hold together. But that bridge is expensive. Interest rates on revolving debt sit at levels that turn small balances into long-term weight. Minimum payments keep accounts open but rarely move balances down, and because essentials don't stop costing money, the cycle repeats. Medical expenses deepen the trap. Even with insurance, Deductibles and out-of-pocket costs arrive without warning. One emergency visit can wipe out months of careful planning. When health doesn't wait for savings to rebuild, credit becomes the only option left. This is how debt stops being a choice and becomes a condition. People know it isn't ideal. They feel the stress every time a statement arrives, but they also know that without it, something else would go unpaid. Housing, food, transportation to work. Over time, this pressure changes how people think about money. Debt feels permanent. Interest feels inevitable. Getting ahead feels theoretical. And when that belief sets in, the cost of living crisis stops being purely financial. It becomes psychological. That's where we go next. Listen closely to how people talk about money now. At first, it sounds like stress, then it turns into frustration, and eventually, for many, becomes something else entirely. Detachment. A man describes his routine: 6 days a week at work, nearly 4 hours of driving every day. Nothing left when he gets home, no energy, no money, no sense that the effort is building toward anything better. He isn't angry, he isn't dramatic, he's numb. I don't even know what I'm working toward anymore, he says. Well, that sentence matters, because this is what happens when effort and reward stop feeling connected. People don't lose motivation because they're lazy. They lose motivation because motivation no longer changes the outcome. When every raise gets absorbed by rent, insurance, groceries, and debt, progress stops feeling real. The future stops feeling reachable. And when the future feels closed off, behavior changes. This is where phenomena like doom spending appear, not as rebellion, not as irresponsibility, but as resignation. If saving doesn't move you forward, saving feels pointless. If discipline doesn't create stability, discipline feels exhausting. Some people respond by cutting everything back to the bone, living in constant anxiety, afraid to spend $1 on themselves. Others do the opposite, spending small amounts on comforts, distractions, or short-term relief. Neither response is irrational. They're both adaptations to the same pressure. Financial strain doesn't stay contained inside bank accounts. It bleeds into relationships. It delays families. It fuels burnout and anxiety. It turns every decision into a calculation and every plan into a risk. People carry the weight of uncertainty into their jobs, their homes, and their sense of identity. And when that weight doesn't lift, year after year, it reshapes how an entire generation thinks about work, money, and hope. This is the moment when the conversation shifts from budgets to something deeper: meaning. For decades, the promise was simple: work hard, make responsible choices. And over time, life gets better. That promise didn't guarantee wealth, it didn't eliminate struggle, but it offered something powerful: progress. The belief that effort compounded, that stability was attainable, that tomorrow could be better than today. That belief is weakening. Home ownership, once a cornerstone of middle-class life, is delayed by years or abandoned entirely. Savings struggle to grow faster than rising costs. The idea that each generation will be better off than the last no longer feels automatic. Economic mobility hasn't disappeared, but it has narrowed. The system now demands more for less. More education, more flexibility, more hours, more sacrifice. And even then, the outcome is uncertain. Yet here's the part that rarely gets acknowledged. Americans haven't lost ambition. They still want stability. They still want time with family. They still want the ability to plan, to breathe, to build. What they've lost is the margin that once made those goals feel achievable. And that matters. Because when people believe the future is closed off, they don't just change how they spend money. They change how they live. They delay dreams. They lower expectations. They stop imagining long-term plans. This is why the cost of living crisis isn't just an economic issue. It's a social one, a psychological one, a structural one. Understanding this doesn't magically fix it. It doesn't lower rent or erase debt, but it does something important. It reframes the struggle. It shifts the blame away from individuals and toward the system that quietly recalculated survival without adjusting income to match. And that reframing matters because shame keeps people isolated. Understanding reconnects them. When you realize millions of others feel the same pressure, the same exhaustion, the same confusion, the struggle stops feeling personal and starts feeling shared. So as we move deeper into 2026, the real question isn't just how expensive life has become. It's what kind of society emerges when survival consumes this much energy, when effort no longer creates momentum, when stability feels delayed instead of earned, when people are working harder than ever just to stand still. The cost of living in America is no longer measured only in dollars. It's measured in exhaustion, in plans put on hold, in people doing everything right and still feeling stuck. And if this breakdown helped you see the bigger picture, then this channel exists for you. This is GeoGlobe, where we break down the forces shaping daily life, power, and survival across the world. If you don't want surface-level answers, subscribe. Because understanding the system is the first step toward not being crushed by it. And now I'll ask you this, honestly. What part of this reality feels closest to your life right now?